Brian Delway had never planned to stay long. The house wasn't even his. It had belonged to his late sister, a modest two-story place tucked neatly into a quiet neighborhood where lawns were symmetrical, mailboxes all matched, and no one parked on the street for longer than 15 minutes. He moved in only temporarily, managing her estate while dealing with legal formalities. He didn't hang pictures on the walls or unpack more than a single suitcase, but he did place two heavy, antique porch chairs on the front steps, the same ones their mother had left behind when she passed. A quiet homage to family roots carved in dark mahogany and worn smooth from decades of use. He liked sitting there in the early evening after work, sipping tea and letting the silence settle over him like a soft blanket. It didn't take long for the first problem to arrive, and it came in the form of a woman named Karen. She wasn't introduced that way. She didn't need to be. She approached with the confidence of someone who believed she owned the pavement beneath her designer flats. Mid-50s, heavily made up, her wide beige blazer strained at the shoulders as she leaned forward, clipboard clutched to her chest. Without so much as a hello, she asked Brian when he planned to remove the chairs. He blinked confused, then replied simply that he wasn't planning to. Karen's nostrils flared. "They disrupt the visual harmony of the block," she said, tapping her clipboard. "All exterior furnishings must be in compliance with approved street aesthetics. These are not." He asked if this was a suggestion or a rule. She didn't answer, just turned and walked away with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Brian watched her leave, mildly amused. He'd dealt with bureaucratic types before, people more interested in the idea of order than the people it affected. But this was just a pair of chairs. Solid wood, hand-carved, entirely on his private porch. It seemed absurd. That night, he looked through the house documents, the title deed, and any HOA agreements his sister might have signed. There was no mention of restrictions on porch furniture, let alone chairs deemed too visually unaligned. He went to bed thinking it was probably just a one-time confrontation from a bored neighbor with too much time, but by the end of the week, he would find that Karen's clipboard held more than checklists. It held intent. And she wasn't going to let go of control easily. The next sign that things wouldn't just blow over came quietly, almost passively, like a warning that didn't know it was a warning. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Brian stepped out to find one of the porch chairs missing. For a moment, he stood there, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The other chair was still there, untouched, its carved armrest catching the slant of morning light. But its pair, the one that used to sit directly beside it, was gone without a trace. There were no tire marks on the grass, no note, no obvious sign of disturbance. Just absence. He looked around the yard, even checked the side of the house, thinking maybe someone had moved it for some bizarre reason. Nothing. The chair had vanished. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but something about the silence of it all set him on edge. He checked his mailbox and found a white envelope tucked among circulars and bills. It had no return address. Inside was a typed letter, cool and terse. It stated that his property was in violation of neighborhood appearance guidelines and that he would be fined $480 if he failed to comply with removal standards within 3 business days. No contact number, no signature. Just a reference code at the bottom, R11. That was it. Brian stood by the open mailbox, the letter fluttering slightly in the wind, his jaw tight. There had been no hearing, no warning. Just a fine and a missing chair. Still, Brian wasn't impulsive. He didn't start yelling or knocking on doors. Instead, he walked back inside and sat down at the kitchen table, pulling his laptop toward him. He composed a response, calm, precise, legally toned, and sent it via certified mail and email to the property management group listed on the HOA documents. He cited the terms of his deed, the lack of written regulations regarding porch furniture, and requested a full explanation of the violation under the supposed R11 clause. He included a photograph of the chairs from before one went missing, and stated in no uncertain terms that removal of private property without consent constituted theft. Then he waited. That evening, when he returned from a job in the outskirts of town, he found the remaining chair tipped over on the lawn with a fluorescent orange sticker slapped across its back. Final notice. It wasn't the work of weather. Someone had been there. Irritated but still not rattled, Brian took the chair back up the steps and placed it exactly where it had always been. This time, he chained it to the railing, not out of spite, but out of principle. He wasn't going to play games, but he wasn't going to fold either. The next day, he discovered that his access code for the gated neighborhood parking lot had been deactivated. When he called the automated line to report it, the voice menu directed him to a compliance review office. After 20 minutes on hold, a soft-spoken representative told him the restriction was most likely connected to an unresolved violation. She couldn't give details, just suggested he attend the monthly meeting to review the community code enforcement alignment. He asked if she could clarify that phrase. She could not. Brian decided then that this was no longer a misunderstanding. It was targeted. Someone was exerting pressure in layers, quietly eroding his access, his rights, and his patience. And the most infuriating part was that it was all being done under the thin veil of policy and regulation. Rules no one could explain, written somewhere inaccessible but enforced like scripture. The next day, his trash bins weren't emptied, though everyone else's on the street had been. The day after that, he received a second envelope, thicker this time, containing a full page of community infraction codes, many of which made no sense and none of which had visible dates, context, or references. Just line items like disruption of uniformity, unauthorized exterior additions, and failure to comply with collective visual culture. It would have been comical if it weren't so calculated. Brian wasn't a lawyer, but he knew when something stank of power masquerading as order. And he also knew that confronting the people who operated like this directly wasn't the answer. They didn't operate with honor. They operated with leverage, bureaucracy, and plausible deniability. That's when he reached out to a law firm he'd once subcontracted for irrigation on a municipal project. Not flashy, not aggressive, but known for their quiet efficiency in real estate and land use disputes. He didn't tell them everything, not yet. But he started the process. Quietly, just like everything in this neighborhood seemed to be. If Karen and her clipboard thought they were dealing with someone who would roll over and disappear, they were going to be deeply disappointed. Brian had expected silence after the legal response he submitted. Maybe a stall tactic or a half-hearted attempt at walking back the fine. But what followed wasn't silence. It was escalation. Not loud or dramatic. Not the kind of escalation that left broken windows or slashed tires, but something colder, more deliberate. Something that had been perfected over years by people who operated best when no one was watching. It started with his mail. One day, his packages stopped arriving. Tracking numbers showed items marked delivered, but his porch remained empty. Then came the missing utility bill, then the water shutoff notice that arrived only after the service had already been disconnected for non-payment. He contacted the utility company, spent hours on hold, only to be told the change of mailing address had been confirmed online. He never made that request. When he asked for an IP log, he was told it would require a subpoena. He wasn't surprised, just angry. His lawn, which he kept trimmed and neat, suddenly became the subject of 2 separate citations for non-conforming edge management. When he tried to ask what that meant, the woman on the phone read from a script and redirected him to the Architectural Standards Subcommittee, which met once a month by appointment only. He called anyway, left a message, and received no reply. Then came the surveillance. Subtle at first. A parked car down the street that didn't move for days. A man with a clipboard who paused too long in front of his house. A woman jogging with a GoPro clipped to her chest, passing the same spot 3 times in an hour, always slowing as she passed his porch. It would have sounded paranoid if he hadn't been the one living it, and yet Brian didn't retaliate emotionally. He documented. He installed discrete cameras of his own, tied them into his existing irrigation system software, and began recording every hour of every day. He set up motion alerts that pinged his phone when someone stepped on his property. He created a separate drive where everything was stored, backed up daily to a cloud server under a different name. He started keeping a physical logbook too. Dates, times, details, people, vehicles. Not because he was building a case, but because he knew this wasn't random, and it would eventually come to a head. The worst moment came on a Friday morning. A truck rolled up slowly while he was working on his front hedges. It had a private contractor logo, one he didn't recognize. 2 men in uniform stepped out and walked straight to the property line. One held a clipboard, the other a roll of yellow tape. When Brian asked what they were doing, they said they were there on behalf of the Neighborhood Design Enforcement Division. He asked for ID. They refused. He told them to leave. They ignored him and began marking the grass with stakes. That's when Brian took out his phone, hit record, and informed them calmly that they were trespassing on private property, that he was notifying local law enforcement, and that any further steps taken would be considered a violation of civil code. One of them laughed, the other just shrugged. They left, but not before leaving a laminated sign on his mailbox that read, "Pending visual review." That night, someone scattered fertilizer all over his front lawn, enough to burn patches into the grass by morning. He knew it wasn't random. It wasn't kids or a prank. It was a message. We can touch your land without ever stepping inside your door. He didn't sleep much after that, and when he did, it was shallow, eyes half open to the sound of tires crunching gravel just beyond his driveway. It wasn't until the following week that something shifted. His lawyer, Kelly Stone, a sharp, meticulous woman with little patience for pettiness, called him after reviewing the enforcement language used in the HOA's notices. She sounded irritated, almost amused. "There's no R11 clause in the official documents," she said. "What they're referencing might be an internal code, but it's not legally binding. More importantly, their architectural review board doesn't have enforcement authority on privately held lots unless there's structural interference or safety risk. A chair on a porch doesn't qualify." Brian felt a quiet surge of satisfaction, but he didn't smile. He knew better. "Can we make that known?" he asked. "Not yet," Kelly replied. "Let them keep building the wall. The higher it gets, the louder the fall." 2 days later, his access to the neighborhood's shared facilities was revoked. Gym, pool, garden commons. His ID badge simply stopped working. A letter arrived the next day stating he had been placed on administrative probation, pending resolution of ongoing compliance concerns. It wasn't punishment, they claimed, just policy. Another neighbor, a man Brian had spoken to only twice, started parking his SUV inches from Brian's driveway, blocking his line of sight. When he asked politely if he could move it, the man said, "We were told it's first come, first serve," even though Brian's curb had been marked as private for years. Still, Brian didn't fight fire with fire. He filed an official complaint with the county zoning office regarding the unauthorized surveillance and landmarkings. He sent copies of his logs and security footage. He contacted the postal inspector about the tampered deliveries. He filed an affidavit about the unsolicited utility changes. And then, as quietly as the harassment had started, he made an inquiry of his own about 4 foreclosed properties in the district. His lawyer submitted the request. He didn't appear in person. He didn't announce it, but he waited. Karen might have had the clipboard, the street's ear, and the kind of petty power that made her feel like royalty. But Brian had something better: patience, documentation, and the understanding that if the rules are used like weapons, then it only takes one quiet stroke of the pen to change the battlefield. It was a cloudless morning when Brian finally saw movement on the county's foreclosure auction portal. He had been checking it regularly for weeks, never obsessively, always deliberately, as part of a broader rhythm he had built around keeping his life functional amidst the daily erosion of comfort. He didn't have fantasies of revenge. He wasn't playing a hero in a personal movie. What he wanted was leverage, real, unshakable, documented control. And that meant ownership. There, in plain text, were 3 listings for parcels within the neighborhood, each marked final stage with auction date scheduled just 10 days out. One of them was for a vacant lot near the entrance gate, currently labeled as a recreational green space maintained by the HOA. Another was a small triangular parcel with access utility infrastructure running through it. Hardly desirable, but critical in terms of jurisdictional power. The third was what made Brian sit back in his chair. It was a property directly connected to the structure used by the neighborhood association as its informal office. Technically zoned as residential, but long since converted internally into what Karen had always referred to as the community hub. The lots weren't being sold for outrageous sums. The HOA hadn't paid the property taxes on those parcels for several years, likely assuming their nonprofit status gave them some immunity, or that no one would dare challenge their claim. But that's the thing about bureaucratic oversight. It works in silence until someone decides to pay attention. Brian contacted Kelly Stone that same afternoon. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She simply confirmed the filing window, drafted the paperwork under a trust-managed corporate name, and submitted the initial intent to bid. There would be no direct link to him, not yet. The beauty of anonymity wasn't just in protection, it was in watching the balance shift without anyone realizing it. The following days unfolded with a sense of eerie calm. The harassment didn't stop, but it plateaued. No new fines, no more surveillance joggers. The silence was almost suspicious. Karen, however, began appearing more often near the office building, sometimes leading groups of clipboard-wielding volunteers, sometimes alone, standing by the garden bench just watching people go by. She didn't look at Brian when they passed each other on the sidewalk, but he could feel the tension tightening like a drawstring. She knew something was changing. She just didn't know what. On the morning of the auction, Brian didn't attend in person. Instead, Kelly represented the trust, bidding cleanly and methodically. There was almost no competition. The lots were acquired in less than 20 minutes. Quietly, efficiently, and without a single confrontation. No headlines, no lawsuits. Just land, transferred from one title to another legally and completely. By noon, Brian held controlling interest over a narrow corridor of land that, while small in acreage, cut directly through the operational nerve center of the HOA's authority. The garden path? His. The office's delivery zone? His. The outdated utility shed that housed network boosters and irrigation timers? Also his. And most critically, the empty lot previously used for storage and meeting overflow was now under his management. He didn't need to issue ultimatums. He only needed to wait. The reaction didn't take long. 3 days later, Karen rang his doorbell for the first time since their initial encounter. She was dressed in her usual blazer and slacks, but her face was drawn tighter, makeup a little too precise. She smiled, but her eyes didn't. "We need to discuss something that affects the entire neighborhood," she said without being invited in. Brian stepped out and closed the door behind him. "I figured this would come up," he said, not smiling. She launched into a monologue about collaboration, legacy, shared responsibility, and how sometimes decisions made at administrative levels might unintentionally appear aggressive. It was the tone of someone trying to walk back a war without admitting she started one. Brian listened, patiently, arms folded. She finally broached the point. "Some of the land that's recently changed hands. It's interfering with essential functions. There may be legal complications." Brian nodded. "There may be, but not for me." She paused, visibly faltering for a moment. Then she tried a different tack. "We've always tried to maintain a certain level of visual and cultural cohesion here. I know things got off on the wrong foot, but maybe we can realign." It was a practiced attempt at reconciliation, thinly veiled with a desperate undertone. Brian didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply said, "I didn't change anything. I just stopped letting you change it for me." With that, he wished her a good day and stepped back inside. That night, he received a cease and desist letter, not from the HOA, but from a law firm representing Karen personally, accusing him of infrastructural disruption. Kelly reviewed it the next morning and laughed. An actual laugh, short and dry. "It's unenforceable," she said. "She's bluffing. She's panicking. She knows you bought the floor out from under her feet, and now she's trying to keep her crown while the throne's already gone." For the first time since this began, Brian allowed himself a moment to sit on the porch. Just sit, not strategize or document. The chairs, now restored as a pair, stood firm on either side of him. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the curb, and for once the air didn't feel tight around his chest. It felt earned. If Karen's first response to losing control of the land beneath her operations was denial disguised as diplomacy, her second was a full retreat into procedure, and this time it was anything but subtle. Within a week of Brian's acquisition becoming known through internal channels, every visible part of his property, from mailbox to hedgeline, was subjected to sudden and inexplicable scrutiny. The silence that had lingered after the auction was replaced by a rush of new mail. Thick, printed notifications from the association's compliance group, all unsigned, all rigidly formatted. There were citations for outdated paint on the eaves, despite photographic proof that the exterior had been redone just 2 years ago. and a warning about non-standard shrub placement that referred to 2 planters on his porch that had been there since the day he moved in. It was obvious to anyone with eyes that the rulebook was being pulled apart and thrown at him, line by line, not for justice, but for pressure. Brian, however, didn't fight the way they expected. He didn't attend the meetings to plead his case or write rebuttals for each accusation. He had learned by now that acknowledging every jab was just part of their trap, to pull him into endless cycles of justification. Instead, he began exercising the rights that came with his new position as landholder. He changed the access protocols for the lot used by the association's maintenance team, requiring formal scheduling to enter. He implemented a contractor approval process for any work performed on his parcels, including the garden space that Karen's team had previously treated like their personal event staging ground. And he sent notices of policy updates to every address adjacent to those lots, written in calm, neutral language, signed by the managing trust. He wasn't threatening them. He was showing them what it meant to follow the rules they loved so much. The real spark, though, came when Karen attempted to host a neighborhood beautification day. It was one of her annual favorites, a public spectacle disguised as volunteerism, where residents were encouraged to repaint benches, trim shared hedges, and conform more fully to her preferred aesthetic. Only this time, her flyers included the areas Brian now owned, without permission. When he received a copy in his mailbox, printed on glossy cardstock, listing his parcels as event zones, he made one phone call to the city's public assembly liaison and had the permit challenged on the grounds of misrepresented ownership. The city responded quickly and the event was officially flagged for review, triggering a temporary hold. Within 24 hours, the online version of the flyer was pulled, and Karen was forced to issue a rescheduling notice in the neighborhood chat forum, citing permit inconsistencies as the reason. That was the first time the narrative cracked. Brian wasn't just the grumpy outsider with an attitude problem anymore. He was someone who had real leverage, who knew the system, and who had taken the time to learn how to apply pressure without ever shouting. And the neighbors noticed. Some kept their distance, but others began to approach him, quietly, privately. One man asked about the process to challenge a yard citation. A woman from 2 streets over asked if he had a list of updated regulations. Another asked almost sheepishly if he planned to make his parcels private, or if he'd consider opening them to general use if things changed. Brian didn't make promises, but he didn't shut them out either. He told them the truth. He wasn't building walls. He was pulling out the bricks that had been quietly built around all of them. Karen, however, doubled down. She issued a formal neighborhood-wide update that new compliance inspections would be carried out with zero tolerance. A move that led to an explosion of new violations. Bicycles left too close to porches, flags that weren't officially sanctioned, even window treatments that didn't match the interior color guidelines. People who had never interacted with Brian began to understand what he had been dealing with. Some pushed back. Subtly at first, then more openly. Small signs began appearing in front yards. Your house, your choice. One family painted their mailbox turquoise. Another installed solar garden lights shaped like owls. It wasn't rebellion. It was quiet defiance, and it spread like a breath of fresh air through a neighborhood that had forgotten what it felt like to choose its own voice. Faced with growing discontent, Karen escalated her tactics further. She filed an appeal with the county zoning board, arguing that Brian's land purchases constituted unfair leverage over community infrastructure. The filing was filled with flowery language about neighborhood cohesion and disruption of communal rhythms, but it lacked the one thing zoning appeals require: evidence of violation. Kelly reviewed the claim and submitted a counterbrief so thoroughly annotated that the county clerk called it preemptively decisive. The appeal was denied without a hearing. It was around this time that Karen's tone shifted from officious to bitter. One evening, Brian caught her standing across the street, not with a clipboard, but with her arms crossed, staring at the newly painted bench he'd installed on his own parcel. The same parcel she once used for event signage. She didn't speak, but her eyes said enough. She was losing grip, not just on the land, but on the illusion that she spoke for the street. And Brian, for the first time, felt the ground tilt. Not because he'd won, but because he hadn't needed to destroy anything to get there. He just let her play her game to its bitter end. That night, he sat on his porch, the 2 antique chairs firmly in place, untouched since the day he anchored them. He sipped his drink and watched as one of the neighbors walked their dog past his yard and gave him a quiet nod. Nothing grand, just an acknowledgement. And sometimes that's all it takes to know you're not alone. The final collapse didn't come with shouting, police tape, or dramatic showdowns under stormy skies. It came with paper, thick, official, notarized. It came with silence, the kind that only arrives when people know a tide has turned but are still pretending they haven't noticed. By the time Karen received the certified letter from the county notifying her that the parcels now controlled by Brian had been formally rezoned for limited private use, she was already losing her grip on the daily operations she once orchestrated. Like a conductor in a beige blazer, the letter itself was neutral in tone, bureaucratic in format, but its implications were seismic. Rezoning meant her events couldn't touch that land anymore. Her signage was invalid. Her team could no longer maintain or modify anything without explicit permission. And, most damning of all, their office. Technically an unauthorized conversion of residential space was now sitting on a lot whose ownership and function had legally shifted out from under her. Karen didn't respond immediately. For 2 days she remained invisible, and the neighborhood, sensing the power vacuum, seemed to exhale for the first time in years. The chat forums went quiet. There were no new warnings or inspections. No mailboxes were cited for non-regulation flag height. People stopped peeking through blinds and started walking a little slower, as if remembering what it felt like to exist without that constant, invisible supervision. Then, late on the third afternoon, a white SUV pulled into Brian's drive. Karen stepped out wearing a suit that looked like it had been pressed too many times, her makeup slightly uneven, and her hair set in a tighter bun than usual, as though she were trying to pull herself together by the roots. She carried no clipboard this time, just a letter and a forced smile. She didn't ask to come inside. She didn't offer apologies or explanations. She simply handed him the envelope. "You'll want to read this," she said. "It's a proposal. There's still room to cooperate. We don't have to be at odds." Brian opened it on the porch while she stood there, trying to pretend her world wasn't cracking beneath her. The letter was from a lawyer, one of hers, not the association's, offering a private settlement. They proposed a partial leaseback of the rezoned land for event use in exchange for ceasing further legal filings and dissolving any complaints against his property. They even included a modest monthly stipend to support neighborhood harmony. Brian didn't speak for several long seconds. Then he folded the letter, handed it back, and said quietly, "You don't get to rent back what you gave away." Karen's smile stiffened. She looked as if she wanted to say more, but nothing came. She turned, walked back to her car, and drove off without another word. Brian watched the SUV turn the corner and disappear. He knew that wasn't the last he'd hear of her, but it was the last time she'd arrive from a position of authority. The next week, something happened that would have been unthinkable months ago. A group of residents called a meeting, not through official HOA channels, but through handwritten invitations slipped into mailboxes. No corporate logos, no agenda. Just a time, a place, and a quiet line at the bottom. "Let's talk." Brian attended not to speak, but to listen. The meeting was held in one of the homes bordering the rezoned garden parcel. 23 people showed up. Not a large number, but enough to feel real. People talked. They didn't rant or accuse, they asked questions, they shared experiences. Some admitted they had been afraid to speak up when the rules started to suffocate. Others said they had stopped attending events because it all felt performative. One man said plainly, "I thought it was normal until he didn't." No one named Karen, but her absence hung over the room like smoke after a fire. Near the end, someone asked Brian if he intended to build on the land he owned. He said no. That wasn't the point. "I'm not here to put anything new in place," he said. "I just wanted the ground under my feet to be mine again." That silence returned, not cold, not hostile, just deep, thoughtful, a silence that meant something had changed. 2 days later, Karen submitted her resignation as HOA president in a one-paragraph email to the management group. It circulated fast, and though some neighbors reacted with cautious optimism, others wondered aloud what would happen next. Brian didn't answer. He knew this wasn't a victory, not really. It was a correction, a rebalancing, a reminder that when people forget the difference between governance and control, it takes only one well-placed act of resistance to bring the tower down. He spent that weekend cleaning up the parcels, trimming hedges, resealing a cracked bench, power washing the path near the old garden. Not because he had to, but because he could. On Sunday evening, a family walked by and stopped to rest there. Their kid climbed onto the bench and started asking questions about the wooden owl perched beside it. A decoration Brian had placed not for show, but for memory. The parents smiled. Brian waved. No one asked him for permission. No one took a photo. No one posted it online. They just existed in the space he had reclaimed. And in a neighborhood that once believed ownership was about enforcement, that quiet coexistence was the loudest change of all. By the time summer settled fully over the neighborhood, the old order had faded into memory. There were no more inspection rounds, no more pastel flyers taped to doors announcing mandatory meetings, and no more fines disguised as friendly reminders. The lawn signs about visual cohesion were quietly removed, and the monthly bulletin, once filled with detailed behavioral expectations, stopped arriving altogether. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was restorative. People began repainting their porches, not to rebel, but because for the first time in years they could choose the color. Mailboxes became mismatched. Gardens grew a little wilder. Wind chimes returned. Brian's property, once watched like a threat, became a point of quiet reference. Not a landmark of dominance, but of balance. He never raised his voice, never staged a protest. He had simply held his ground until the ground shifted around him. Karen left without fanfare. Her house was put up for sale by mid-July. The listing was clinical. 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, well-maintained. Nothing to hint at the history wrapped around those beige walls. She moved out early one morning, her SUV packed to the roof. She didn't say goodbye, and no one stood at their doors to watch her go. The neighborhood didn't celebrate her departure. It simply continued without her, like a body adjusting after a long-held breath is finally released. As for Brian, he stayed longer than he'd planned. The house, once his sister's, no longer felt like borrowed space. He repaired the porch railing, sanded the handrails, and repainted the trim in a dark navy tone his mother once favored. The 2 antique chairs remained exactly where they belonged, side by side, facing the street. Sometimes people stopped and asked about them. Sometimes he let them sit. He didn't speak much about what had happened, not because he was bitter, but because the story was already written into the street itself. Everyone had felt it in some way. He knew he wouldn't live there forever. He wasn't rooted like some of the families who had been there for decades. But he also knew he wouldn't leave quietly. Before he moved on, he filed paperwork officially converting his parcels into protected private access commons, with minimal restrictions and no external governance. The new community group forming in Karen's absence adopted it as a model, not because they wanted to emulate Brian, but because his structure didn't require permission to be lived in. It just worked. On the day he packed up his last box, Brian sat on the porch for a while, the sun cutting long slants through the trees. He looked at the street, not uniform, not perfect, but alive. As he stood and walked down the steps for the last time, he paused by the chairs. He didn't take them. He left them on the porch, exactly where they had always been. Not as a symbol, as a reminder.